Okay, this is it. The last video. Are you excited? I'm excited. Do I sound excited? Maybe that's because I am excited. The last video. So, today we're going to talk about evaluation research, or applied research, or policy analysis. Whatever. We're going to be talking about studying real things. I mean, not like you weren't studying real things before, but we're talking about studying criminal justice programs today. And you can do this in a exploratory manner, in a descriptive manner, and in a explanatory manner. So applied research or evaluation research can be any form of research, but what sets it apart from any other form of research is that it involves policy or programs. So, some important jargon to think about is, so evaluation research, when I say that term, is research that is, that can be any type of method. It can be survey research, it can be RCT, it can be time trend series, interrupted time series, it can be panel study, it can be a cohort study, it can be any form of design, but it's there to evaluate the impact of an intervention. And when I say intervention, I mean a policy or a law or a rule or a new way of doing things or a program. Right? So intervention, treatment, program, policy, all the same thing. It's something aimed at fixing or addressing something. So evaluation research is when we want to see how well does something do something in a criminal justice sense. So let's say I come up with a cognitive behavioral therapy program to help inmates deal with whatever their issues are, right? And so I send these inmates through this program, and then I test how many of them recidivate within 3 years. That is evaluation research, because I'm evaluating the cognitive behavioral therapy program in the prison. Same with like studying hotspots interventions or drug programs or the assault rifles ban of 1994. Those are all evaluation research. Another aspect of evaluation research, and we'll talk about this a little later here in a couple seconds, is problem analysis. So what happens when I have too much coffee? Problem analysis. It's we want to, and this is usually what we do before we study an intervention or a program, is we see how bad is a certain problem. Like, how bad is recidivism in the United States right now? Or how bad is the drug problem in Evansville? Or what type of drug problem do we have in Evansville? Or how much money are we spending on a certain problem? Right? So problem analysis is how bad is an issue? Like, to what extent do we need to fix something? And then when you have a problem analysis done, you can say, okay, these are the 10 things that might address this problem. So oftentimes, problem analysis is what precedes evaluation research. You say, this is a problem. We have a scientific basis for this problem. It's not just, hey, there's a drug, but now you go and you study to what extent that drug problem exists. That is problem analysis. You have a scientific basis for stating that there's a problem. And then you also say, these are some things you can do to fix that problem. Then the practitioner will pick one of those solutions that you've offered, and then you study the effectiveness of that solution, and then at that point you've conducted evaluation research. So problem analysis, then you select an intervention, then you study that intervention, and then you've conducted, and that is evaluation research. Now, when you implement a policy or a program or an intervention that has been proven by science to be effective, you have just implemented an evidence-based policy. So hotspots policing is an evidence-based policy. Recidivism reducing things like cognitive behavioral therapy or vocational programs or educational programs or drug programs, those are evidence-based policies. So it's when criminal justice agencies make decisions that are linked to scientific evaluation. All right? So you are using science to help you implement a program. Whether you are implementing a program and having it tested at that point in time to see how well it worked, or whether you are implementing a program based on what you've read in science and then testing it afterwards, that is evidence-based policy. It's when you are looking at what is the scientific evidence before I make my policy decision, right? Like 3 strikes rules. You guys know what 3 strikes laws are? That is, if you have 3 felonies, you go to prison for the rest of your life. That is not an evidence-based policy. That's what we call a knee-jerk policy. It's a policy based on common sense and rhetoric, but it has no scientific basis. In fact, when you look at it scientifically, those are absolutely useless. They don't actually fix any problems. They just cause us to spend more money on prisons, and you could even make the argument that they contribute to violence that occurs in prisons because when you're just locking people away, throwing away the key, right? So it just makes the problem worse. Evidence-based policy is something like hotspots policing or problem-oriented policing, community-oriented policing, cognitive behavioral therapy programs, drug treatment, needle sharing program, needle exchange programs, not needle sharing, needle exchange programs. So when do we do evaluation research? Whenever a new policy or program is implemented and we want to see whether it goes as planned. That's it. So I've mentioned some examples like rehabilitation programs or cognitive behavioral therapy or drug programs or needle exchanges or safe injection sites, hotspots policing, problem-oriented policing, community-oriented policing, pulling levers, drug courts, veteran courts, juvenile courts, right? Those are all different types of interventions. Legalizing marijuana can be considered an intervention. You're saying, hey, we're changing policy here. Legalizing it, man. And regulating it. Now you can study what impact has that had on crime. A lot of people think it'll reduce crime. Which I also agree, it probably would. There's some research, some UCR-based research that's shown some reductions in crime, but again, it hasn't been legalized across the country. It hasn't been legal for that long in certain states, so we really won't know a true answer to that question for another decade or so, whether the legalization of marijuana has really reduced crime. But I think just from a basic standpoint, it will, right? Because every time you make something illegal, you are creating crime. Every time you make a law, you create crime, right? Every time you say this is the way something should be done, you've now created the antithesis of that, right? If you say this is the rule, you've just created crime because someone is going to do that the wrong way, right? So it should reduce crime because you're taking that away now. But we'll see. Evaluation research is when you're looking at something that we implemented, is it going as planned? So there's 2 types of evaluation research that often occur at the same time. Program evaluations is when you're looking at outcomes. And what I mean by outcomes is so an outcome can be crime, right? Does hotspots policing reduce crime? So does it reduce our outcome, which is crime? Do needle exchange programs reduce heroin-related overdoses? Which is, again, an outcome. We're looking for something to be reduced, right, or increased. Do needle exchange programs reduce the spread of HIV, right? Again, is it reducing or increasing something? Does community-oriented policing increase legitimacy, right? You're looking at outcomes. That's program evaluation. It can also be known as an impact assessment. Just depends on who you're speaking to. Then a process evaluation is, has the program been implemented in the way that it was supposed to be implemented? For instance, let me give you an example. Cognitive behavioral therapy programs tend to work when you implement them in prisons, meaning that if you go into when you go into a prison, you give them cognitive behavioral therapy, you can reduce recidivism by a significant amount, all right? Now, the problem is, when that cognitive behavioral therapy program is run by the prison officials themselves. So if I'm a professor, I go to the prison officials and say, hey guys, do this. And they call that a practitioner-run program. Then it's not as successful as a demonstrative program, right? A program where an actual professor or people who have training in cognitive behavioral therapy go and implement the program, right? They implement the program. They run it, right? But it only runs because it's a demonstrative program. It only goes for 6-7 months, maybe a year, right? Those tend to be much more successful than the practitioner-run ones, because the practitioner-run ones are not implemented the way that they're supposed to be implemented, right? So a process evaluation is, has this intervention been implemented the way that it's been supposed to, is it implemented the way it's supposed to work, right? I remember when I worked at Domino's Pizza back in the day, we had this machine called the Auto Cheeser. It was a pain in my ass, okay? Because it's this massive contraption. You had a cup, you put the cheese at the top, and you press this button, and it spreads the cheese equally across the pizza. Now, the great thing is, in terms of outcomes, that reduced the amount of cheese we used while spreading it optimally across the pizza, meaning the company saves money, and we don't use as much cheese. So in terms of outcomes, its intended outcomes are to reduce food cost, right? However, this machine sucks when you're using it because it has all kinds of little nooks and crannies in it. So at the end of the shift, at the end of the day, when you have to wash this thing, you have to freaking spray it down. You have to fold things back to get the pieces of cheese out of there. Otherwise, it rots and gets disgusting. So what ended up happening was we never used it, right? We had it installed, but when we got busy, we moved it aside. We didn't use it as it was intended to be used. It wasn't implemented as intended. So if someone had done if someone had done only a program evaluation on that, they would have been like, it doesn't really impact cheese. It's a useless intervention. But if they had done a process and program evaluation, they would have been like, oh, yeah, it's not working because they're not using it the way it's supposed to be used. Right? And so oftentimes with prison programs that are aimed at fixing recidivism, what happens is when we don't see changes in recidivism and we go and we look at the process evaluation, we're like, oh, well, it wasn't implemented the way it was supposed to, right? And this is not just the case with prisons, it's the same when it comes to court side interventions or policing side interventions. When it's not implemented the way it's supposed to be implemented, the outcomes aren't impacted to the extent that they could be. And so that's why a good criminal justice researcher would study would conduct both a program and process evaluation on any sort of intervention. So when you get started, what you want to do is you usually want to do what's known as a pre-evaluation, right? So you get support from the organization. Then you sit down with them and you say, okay, why did you even implement this? What did you want from this program? Did you implement this because you wanted to appease the public? You wanted to reduce fear of crime? Or did you implement this because you wanted to reduce actual crime? Did you want to reduce a certain type of crime? And then you want to find out, what type of data do you have available? How are you recording things? Are you guys recording crime? How are you doing that? How are you keeping tabs on it? Right? Because you need to find out if they are not recording crime in a systematic way. You need to implement that as a researcher, right? Which is often why it's good to work with the agency as they're implementing it. Is there another stakeholder that you don't know about, right? The police might be the direct stakeholder, but the freaking mayor might be interjecting and saying, hey, do this, hey, do that, or city council might be lording money over them. So you need to find out who does what, who is involved, who wants certain outcomes out of this, and how important are they? So a pre-evaluation is what have we got here? What do we have to begin with? Where do I need to implement things? Where do I need to ask for things? Where do I need funding? Where do I need to get additional support from? What do I need to actually look at? Right? What do they want me to look at? Oftentimes what you find is that different stakeholders want different things, right? different stakeholders want different outcomes. Like, let's think of body-worn cameras. Police officers probably want the cameras to be used for evidentiary purposes. So they're probably looking at, are we getting more convictions in court? Whereas community groups like the NAACP or ACLU might want to see more sustained complaints against police officers or less use of force. So depending on who the stakeholder is, there might be a different outcome that they want. And you have to be absolutely aware of all the outcomes that all the stakeholders want and the amount of power that they have over that study. You must be clear as to exactly what type of outcomes people want you to study. And then you must be clear about the outcomes that you are interested in as a researcher. So when you're conducting a program evaluation, you often want to appease all the stakeholders to the best extent that you can. But then if they don't want the same things that you think the scientific community might be interested in, you always want to try to work that into your study somehow too. Right? What outcomes do they desire? Because that can be a problem sometimes. Because what happens often is a police agency might want you to come study something, and they really just want you to find that they made a good decision, right? Oh, we want you to show that this happened, or that this didn't happen, and you have to be very careful of that. When it comes to these evaluations, design is important. Yeah, if you can have a randomized evaluation design, right, where you go and you have two shifts of police officers, one shift gets body cameras, the other shift doesn't, or you randomly assign body cameras to one group and to a experimental and control group, that'd be great. But sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you have to do things on a case flow basis, and that's when, as people, let's say you're studying the impacts of a drug program in jail, right? And so as people are arrested, they're assessed on their risks, and then they're put into the program immediately. And so you'll have to get them on a case flow basis, right? And the problem with that is you can't really ensure proper experimental conditions, right? You can't put people in proper experimental and control groups. It's not really random because it depends on how people were arrested. But you can be like, every other person's going to the experimental group, something like that. But it's not quite as rigorous as a randomized evaluation. One of the problems is that sometimes staff don't give a crap. If you're like, look at people who work in prisons, man, these people don't get paid a lot of money. And now if you are implementing a program that's causing them you need to have one meaningful conversation with an inmate once a day, right? If you're getting paid $13 an hour, you're not going to want to have a meaningful conversation with someone who you view as the enemy, right? So it's sometimes difficult to get the staff at these agencies to play ball with you. And, in the research I've done, it has always taken me a very long time to win the affection or to win the trust of patrol officers before they participated in one of my process evaluations. You must be consistent, and you have to get the staff. Like, if it's up to the staff to put people in experimental or control groups, you have to get them to be consistent, right? You must be consistent with your scientific conditions. Oftentimes, you'll have a quasi-experimental design just because of the nature of, when you're studying a program like this, you don't have lab-like controls, right? You don't have lab-like conditions. It's out in a natural setting. You have real-world problems, practical issues, logistical issues, and so you can't always get random assignment or sometimes, practitioners push forward. They implement something, and you haven't had enough time to do a pre-evaluation, and so you don't have a before and after study. You can just do a study after the fact. They call that an ex-post evaluation, which is okay. That happens. You don't have, sometimes, a lot of times with treatment programs in prisons, right? Prisons use treatment programs as an incentive for people to behave well. So sometimes you can't randomly assign people into a treatment program because that'll then undermine the authority and the reward system that a prison might have in place, right? or when you conduct something like a interrupted time series. And that's usually the case with when you're implementing laws, right? A great example is the studying prosecutorial discretion after the implementation of sentencing guidelines, right? So up until the 1980s, there were no guidelines for sentencing people. And so the federal government said, okay, states, you guys have to implement guidelines, because what's happening is you have these racist judges or ethnocentric judges who are sentencing black people to prison and jail for way longer than white people are being sentenced. And so they said each state must have sentencing guidelines so that there is a minimum and a maximum to which you can send someone to prison or jail for. And so after that, this guy named Terrence Meath was like, well, won't that then just allow prosecutors, like if you tie up the amount of discretion that judges have, won't that just then allow prosecutors to go crazy with how they plea bargain or with how they send people to jail? And then what Terrence Meath found was that, it did sort of increase, to some extent, the discretion of prosecutors in terms of how they used their plea bargaining, or how they made plea bargaining decisions, and there was still racial disparities. Right, so interrupted time series is when you look at cross-sectional data, look at when a new policy was implemented or a new law was implemented, and then look at those outcomes and see how they've changed after that intervention was implemented. One thing that you must be careful of is the political context. Right, one of the issues with criminal justice is that a lot of criminal justice policy is tied in politics, right? So, a lot of politicians don't want to seem soft on crime, right? And so programs that are aimed at helping prisoners overcome recidivism often seem to be soft on crime. And so, when you are studying something like that, some politicians might want to see you fail, or some politicians might want to see you succeed. And you can't have politics impact the way you measure things, and you must be very careful of that. Don't try to find findings that people want you to find. Go find what is objectively true. You have to explain to people what works and what doesn't work, right? You have to try not to be impacted by political or business concerns, right? That's a really big issue too. Is that sometimes business, like let's say a body-worn camera manufacturer, right, wants you to find that implementing body-worn cameras can help police officers in this many ways, right? That there's some serious business implications to that. So be very careful about how that works. All right. So with that being said, that was our last lecture. We are done. Make sure you hand in everything that you need to hand in. Make sure you keep an eye on the syllabus. And I will see you next year in a different class. Peace out.